Hello. I've been thinking about three things that we can learn from Mr and Mrs Beaver that help us on our spiritual journey. Oh, and a bonus one at the end. The first thing's in their role as guides and companions on the way. They're some of the best loved characters in Narnia, Mr and Mrs Beaver, and they're sent as helpers for the children, Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy. The children aren't provided with wizards or gurus and preachers, but with creatures who are travellers on the way themselves, who join the children along the same path. We're given different companions at different times in our lives, sometimes for a short season, sometimes for a long season, sometimes to help us with one area of our life, sometimes for another. We don't go it alone. Even the robin is a guide for the four children in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe at first, leading them to Mr Beaver. That's very short term, of course. And then there's the beavers themselves who lead them to Aslan. And once that's done, the beaver's role is over, really. They fade out of the story. That's a bit longer term. And then there's Aslan, who takes over as the children's guide and director, and who's like Christ in this world, who at the end of Matthew's Gospel, in the last thing he says to his disciples, he says, "Remember this, I'm with you always." The beavers are very practical helpers through the woods and the snow, under the moon, finding a route, finding a safe place for the night and so on. And they provide dinner. They give lots of sensible advice about how to respond to events and information about Aslan, the king of the wood. And every now and then I look back over my life and I think about the companions God has sent me over the years. It has to start with my parents, really, who introduced me to the faith in the first place. And Lewis himself, who's been my constant companion from a very early age through his books. And then there's been lots of other people who've been with me for short or long periods and very significant in their help. Sometimes I wish I'd kept up with friends from the past who perhaps were just with me for a short season. And I've realised that sometimes the companions we're sent are not always what we'd expect or would have chosen left to our own devices. I mean, who would have chosen the obnoxious Eustace as a companion on a quest to find the 7 lost lords of Narnia, or gloomy Puddleglum to help rescue Prince Rilian? Anyway, let's give thanks for all our companions on the way. The second thing we learn from Mr and Mrs Beaver is the way they highlight the necessity of relying on Aslan and not self-effort. In the talk after dinner, Mr Beaver informs the children that Mr Tumnus, the fawn, Lucy's friend, has been taken off by the secret police to the witch's house, where he's probably been fixed in stone. And Lucy immediately wants to rescue him. "We must do something to save him," she says. "It's too dreadful. It's all on my account," she says, with great concern and compassion and a certain amount of guilt. It goes on like this. "I don't doubt you'd save him if you could, dearie," says Mrs Beaver, "but you've no chance of getting into that house against her will and ever coming out alive." "Couldn't we have some stratagem?" says Peter. "I mean, couldn't we dress up as something or pretend to be, peddlers or anything, or watch till she's gone out, or, hang it all, there must be some way. The fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr Beaver. We can't just leave him to have that done to him." Knowing what we now know about the witch, it seems a very flimsy sort of stratagem. So Mr Beaver begins to tell them something about Aslan, and he says, "It's he, not you, who will save Mr Tumnus." And he tells them a lot about Aslan's power and greatness. "But meanwhile, what about poor Mr Tumnus?" says Lucy. "The quickest way you can help him is by going to meet Aslan," said Mr Beaver. "Once he's with us, then we can begin doing things. And once Christ is with us, then we can begin doing things." After a bit, they realise Edmund is missing and rush out into the snow, shouting for him. And Peter comes up with a detailed plan involving search parties and lots of shouting until their companions, the beavers, face them with a hard truth. Their brother's gone to the witch, and he will betray them all. And their instinct, again, is to rush off to the witch's castle to rescue their brother. And it's a noble desire. But in their own strength, they're bound to fail. Mrs Beaver points that out. So we so need the wisdom of other people in our lives, of our companions. "Oh, can no one help us?" wailed Lucy. "Only Aslan," said Mr Beaver. "We must go and meet him. That is our only chance now." You see, not our own bright ideas, only Christ. We must go on and meet him. That is our only chance now. The third thing to learn from the Beavers is their faithfulness across the years. The witch's winter has lasted 100 years. In the last battle, it's called the 100 Years' Winter. And Aslan's not been seen in Narnia in Mr Beaver's lifetime, nor his father's. Yet despite the persecution and the deprivations, Mr and Mrs Beaver keep the faith throughout that long winter. And they know the ancient prophecies and they hold on to them. They're inspired by them and strengthened and use them to bring encouragement to the children. Wrong shall be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. So hints there of Isaiah and Revelation, I think, our own great prophecies. God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. And when he bares his teeth, winter meets its death. And when he shakes his mane, we shall have spring again. And there's hints of the poetry of Song of Solomon, I think, to bring hope. For now the winter is past, the rain is over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of singing has come, the voice of the turtle dove is heard in our land. And the other prophecy, when Adam's flesh and Adam's bone sits at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So you see, the Beaver's unshakable faith in Aslan brings in joy and hope and holds off despair. "Have we no hope?" says Susan. "Course we've got a hope," says Mrs Beaver. And then finally we learn from the Beavers that their sheer humble goodness. In the roll call of great Narnian ancestors at the end of the last battle, they're simply called the two good Beavers. To his Oxford friend Owen Barfield, Lewis wrote, "The Beavers aren't there to prevent you taking it too seriously, but to supply the snug and homely, and to give information. I'd have liked that chapter as a child." Well, homeliness was a quality Lewis had long relished with his friend Arthur Greaves. "It was your chief lesson to me," he told Arthur Greaves. So, for example, the dinner with the Beavers in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the quintessence of such homeliness. Their funny little house, shaped like a giant beehive, a very snug little home it is. And the kettle singing, the frying pan hissing, and the marmalade rolls steaming, and the pot of tea, or for Mr Beaver as he pushes back his stool, the mug of beer and a pipe, is all just as Lewis enjoyed it, and the company unpretentious and down to earth. And Mrs Beaver, fussy, chatty, mothering, she accuses everyone else of fussing. In one breath she's in awe that she should live to see with her own eyes the sons and daughters of prophecy coming to Narnia, and in the next breath she's saying, "The kettle's on, the potatoes are boiling." Lewis freely tells us he was given to sins of intellectual pride. It was his besetting sin, he told Arthur Greaves. "I catch myself posturing before the mirror, so to speak, all day long," he told him. And in Mere Christianity, he gives a whole chapter on pride. But Greaves' vision of homeliness, his joy in the humble and the domestic, came as an important spiritual lesson for Lewis. And soon after becoming a Christian, he wrote to Arthur explaining how he found the concept of homeliness helped him to find something lovable in others, even if it's only an oddity, he said, and thereby, but without patronising, attain the virtue of Christian charity. By focusing on others' homely or humble features, he could enjoy people who are on a very different intellectual plane to himself. It's the quiet joy of humble goodness. And lastly, a bonus point from the lives of Mr and Mrs Beaver. And it's the joy with which they bring to the narrative. And as I said earlier, it's a joy born of their love for Aslan. Just notice the love and enthusiasm with which they speak of the King of the Wood. Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He'll settle the White Witch all right. You'll understand when we see him, they say. I love that. You'll understand when you see him. There's a gentle humour in Mr Beaver's pride in his dam and Mrs Beaver's fussing and her saying, I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring. I can't abide the thought of that witch fiddling with it. And before the meal, it says they're preparing to enjoy themselves. And after it, each one leaned back and gave a long sigh of contentment. So Lewis creates this framework of simple pleasure and enjoyment among good friends and good food. Michael Ward, in his book Planet Narnia, calls them a little outpost of jollity. In Surprised by Joy, Lewis spoke of a bright shadow cast over everyday things after he'd had his imagination baptised by reading George MacDonald's story Fantastes. And we see that bright shadow, I think, over everything to do with Mr and Mrs Beaver. It's a quality of holiness and joy in the everyday. So there's the things we can learn from Mr and Mrs Beaver. To reflect on the companions on the way we've been blessed with. The necessity of relying on Aslan, or for us Christ, not self-effort. The beauty of sheer humble goodness. And the joy born of love for Aslan. The joy born of love for Christ.